Welcome to my channel. The vast stars shimmered cold and distant as the alien fleet approached the neutral space between the Empire's borders and Earth. Silent except for the whisper of engines that could bend light itself, and deep inside the main ship sat the princess, a being of power and mystery, born to rule over galaxies, feared by many and desired by more. Yet now she sat motionless, eyes fixed on the projection of a single human face. She had made her choice, not from her court, not from her kind, but from the distant blue planet they once mocked, the one they called fragile and wild humanity. This was the first breeding trial. An ancient royal tradition meant to create hybrid heirs, and in the history of the Galactic Council, no alien royal had ever chosen a human. The room filled with murmurs and disbelief. Her advisors protested, other species laughed. The council chambers burned with political chaos. But the princess only whispered a name, and the human's image grew. Larger on the screen, Jake, a simple engineer, unknown to the galaxy. Yet soon, the entire universe would know his name, and what happened next would change everything. When the council announced the news, shock waves traveled through hundreds of star systems, ships stopped mid-transit, leaders argued behind shimmering holographic doors. Some feared humanity's unpredictability. Others mocked the choice's weakness. To them, humans were dangerous, violent, emotional creatures, not fit for royal blood. But the princess had studied the old Earth records. She knew their wars, their victories, their ability to rise from nothing. She admired the fire hidden behind their gentle faces. Jake was brought aboard the royal flagship under a sky of silver glass, the air thick with foreign scents and whispers. Guards stood tall, weapons humming like beasts in cages. He didn't bow, didn't speak much, but his eyes met hers with a kind of quiet strength that unsettled the court. They expected fear, but what they saw was something else, something far older and more dangerous: humanity's defiance. The ceremony began in the Crystal Hall, a place older than most civilizations in the Galactic Council, walls glowing like captured stars, a throne of obsidian rising from the floor like a living creature. The princess stepped down slowly, robes flowing like water, her presence both beautiful and terrifying. Jake walked forward under the watch of hundreds of alien dignitaries. The breeding trial wasn't just about flesh, it was a battle of will, of soul. A merging of two worlds. Ancient law demanded both partners touch the Heartstone, an artifact said to reveal the strength of their bond. Many expected it to shatter or reject the human. But when Jake's hand touched it, the entire hall trembled, light exploded in colors never seen before. The Heartstone didn't reject him. It sang, a sound like a star being born. The princess gasped softly, and the council chamber fell into stunned silence. No one expected a human to awaken the stone. Rumors spread like fire through the galaxy. Fleets repositioned, empires watched, some terrified, others hungry for power. The council tried to stop the union, saying it violated tradition. But the princess stood firm. For the first time in history, she defied her advisors, declaring the human bond unbreakable. Jake was taken through the trial chambers, endless tests designed to break the unworthy. Poisons, illusions, mind storms meant to crush any weak will. He didn't break. He remembered Earth, the wind on his face, the weight of his father's tools, the stubborn strength of his people. The storms came, and he walked through them like a mountain. The council's generals whispered that something in him was dangerous, something they could not control, and that terrified them more than any weapon. As the days passed, the bond between the princess and Jake grew, not just of ritual, but of something deeper, something neither of their worlds understood. She began to see how humanity's emotions, once considered weakness, were a kind of strength, fire that couldn't be caged, laughter that broke walls, anger that burned through chains, and love that rewrote destinies. Meanwhile, deep within the council's war rooms, powerful species plotted, fearing a union that might give humans royal blood. Rites, fleets gathered in the dark, whispers of assassination spread like shadow, and the night before the final binding ceremony, assassins cloaked in void suits struck. But Jake stood in front of the princess, unarmed, defiant, his heart louder than their blades. He fought not like a warrior trained by empires, but like a human defending what he loved, raw, unpredictable, unstoppable. When it was over, the floor was stained with silence, and the princess realized something the galaxy never understood humans didn't need crowns to be powerful. The council called an emergency session. Thousands of alien eyes stared down from the grand chamber, accusing, demanding, warning. But the princess didn't bend. Jake stood beside her. No armor, no throne, just a human. And yet his presence made entire fleets hesitate. The Heartstone pulsed between them like a second sun. A symbol that the galaxy's old rules had already begun to crack. Empires that once laughed now watched with unease. For they saw something they couldn't control: hope, fire, humanity. The vote to dissolve the Union failed as the Heartstone's light forced ancient oaths to awaken. An old law no one remembered came alive, declaring their bond a new royal line. And with it came power no empire could ignore. The princess turned to Jake, her voice soft but steady, saying the words that would echo through centuries. They will fear us now, not because of what we are, but because of what we've become together. From that day, star maps changed, alliances shifted. The Galactic Council that once mocked humanity now found itself facing something far greater than a species. They faced a story, a legend, a spark that would ignite revolutions across space, and Jake, the quiet engineer from a forgotten corner of Earth, became a name spoken in the same breath as kings and gods. The princess and the human rewrote the old order not with weapons alone, but with something far more dangerous to tyrants: unity, love, and unshakable will. And somewhere in the void, the stars themselves seemed to burn brighter, as if they knew a new chapter of HFY had just begun. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories. Because sometimes the greatest power in the galaxy is simply being human. The royal flagship drifted silently through the void, its hull glowing faintly like the skin of some ancient cosmic beast. And deep inside its silver corridors, Jake walked alone, escorted by silent guards whose glowing eyes watched every step. Their armor reflected stars, their movements precise. Inhuman, the ship itself was alive in its stillness, corridors curving in ways that defied logic. A reminder that he was far from Earth, far from the familiar smell of rain and old engine oil. He felt the weight of every alien gaze on him as he passed. Whispers like soft blades cut through the air. Some mocking, some fearful. They called him a primitive, a mistake, a wild card the princess should have never chosen. But Jake's steps didn't falter, his heartbeat steady, like the rhythm of a storm, gathering in silence. The kind of storm only humans could carry in their bones. When the doors to the trial chamber opened, the light nearly blinded him. Hundreds of alien nobles stood in their balconies, wrapped in shimmering fabrics, their eyes wide with curiosity and contempt. They expected to see a creature out of control, trembling, begging. But Jake only tilted his head slightly, his jaw tight, his silence louder than their sneers. And at the center of the room stood the princess, tall, radiant, and calm. But Jake saw it. Just a flicker. Fear in her golden eyes, not of him, but for him, because she knew what the council was planning. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a test meant to break him publicly, to humiliate the human before the galaxy and make their bond impossible, a cruel tradition hidden behind the veil of honor. The chamber's floor shifted, becoming transparent, revealing the blackness of space beneath his feet. And with a low hum, the first trial began. Jake felt a pull inside his chest, like gravity itself had claws, dragging him down into a void of illusions. They tried to show him Earth burning, cities falling, oceans turning black, tried to drown him in fear. But he had seen darkness before, in empty nights, in the faces of people who had nothing but still stood up the next day. The alien lords expected him to scream, but he closed his eyes and remembered the smell of home, the sound of wind through broken trees, the laughter of a mechanic crew under the stars. And slowly, the illusions began to fade. The Heartstone hanging above the throne flickered brighter, responding to him, not rejecting, not bending, but matching his heartbeat. A murmur spread through the balconies, a sound like wind moving through a dead forest. Nobles exchanged glances, their whispers now edged with unease. For centuries they had built their power on fear, and here stood a human who refused to give them the satisfaction of breaking. The princess stepped closer, her long robe trailing like liquid fire, her voice soft but firm, asking him if he wished to continue. And he looked at her, not like a subject, but like an equal, and simply said yes. It wasn't a shout, not a speech, just a word. And yet it carried the weight of an entire species that had always survived by refusing to kneel. The second trial activated. A storm of sound, whispers from ancient minds pressed against his skull, alien thoughts trying to twist his memories, voices screaming, crying, begging him to surrender. But Jake's mind was a stubborn, iron wall, forged by years of quiet resilience. He didn't need magic, didn't need advanced training. He just remembered what it meant to be human, to endure, to adapt, to keep walking even when everything hurt. And then something unexpected happened. The Heartstone flared like a supernova, its light cracking the chamber's ceiling with golden veins of power. The nobles gasped, some stumbled back, because no one in their history had ever made it react this way. No alien prince, no warrior, no legend, only a human engineer from a forgotten world. The princess stared at him in awe, the bond between them pulsing stronger with each trial, and deep in the shadowed corners of the chamber, hidden among diplomats and spies, figures wearing dark cloaks turned to leave, their plans already shifting. For this was no longer a political game they could control. Jake wasn't just surviving. He was rewriting the rules without even realizing it, and as the last echoes of the trial faded, the room that once mocked him now fell silent. Their laughter, frozen in their throats, and far above them, in the endless sea of stars, something stirred. A future none of them were ready for. The night after the trial felt different aboard the royal flagship. The corridors that once hummed with quiet judgment now whispered with something else, something colder, something watching, and Jake could feel it deep in his chest as he stood alone on the balcony overlooking the stars, a human silhouette against a universe that had just learned to fear him. The Heartstone still pulsed faintly somewhere deep within the ship, as if it was alive, as if it knew its song had changed the course of empires. But Jake wasn't thinking about power. He was thinking about the look in the princess's eyes during the trial. Not the royal mask she wore before the council, but the flicker of fear and awe that slipped through. And though he didn't fully understand this alien world, he understood something had begun that couldn't be undone. Below the flagship's golden decks, the council met in secret. Their voices slithered like cold knives in the dark. Some called for the human's execution before the bond ceremony. Others whispered about using him as a weapon. A few even feared him enough to suggest surrendering their vote to the princess. But one thing united them all. They didn't trust him. A human had done what their champions never could, and that was enough to shake a 1,000-year-old order. Among them stood the Wraith Envoy, pale and silent, known for dealing in shadows rather than politics. Its voice barely a ripple in the air, as it promised to solve the problem before dawn. Back in her chamber, the princess removed the heavy ceremonial crown from her head. Her silver hair fell like starlight around her shoulders, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of watching eyes. But her heart raced with something she couldn't control. He had survived, not with power, not with training, but with a strength she couldn't explain, and when she closed her eyes she could still feel the warmth of the Heartstone singing through him. Something in that song had wrapped around her soul like a promise she hadn't expected to make, and somewhere in that feeling was a fear she didn't want to name. When the door opened, Jake stepped into the royal chamber, still dressed in the simple black uniform given to him. His boots worn from the day's trials, and yet he carried himself like someone who belonged there, not because of arrogance, but because he didn't seem to care about their thrones, their rules, their fragile walls. The princess studied him quietly, searching for the weakness the council swore humans had, but she didn't see a pawn or a subject. She saw fire, quiet, steady, burning at the edges of his silence. She asked him why he didn't falter, and his answer came with no grand speech, just a quiet, stubborn truth. Because he had nothing to lose but his soul, and no one took that from a human. That night, the shadows moved, cloaked figures crawled through the silent halls. Their blades coated in poisons no creature had ever survived. They slipped past guards with ease, their mission clear. The death of one human before the bond was sealed. A quiet end to a dangerous future. But they didn't expect the Heartstone to flare the moment the first blade was drawn, nor the princess to stand between death and the human she had chosen. And when the assassins lunged, Jake didn't step back, he stepped forward. His body moved on instinct, forged not in alien academies but in a lifetime of surviving. Fists met steel. The clash echoed like thunder through the chamber. And the assassins realized too late that the council hadn't chosen a weak prey. They had created a storm. When the last shadow fell, the chamber was silent. The princess's hands shook slightly as she stared at the human covered in their enemy's blood, breathing hard but standing unbroken. And for the first time she saw why humans frightened the galaxy so much. Not because they were monsters, but because they refused to die quietly. The royal guards flooded the room too late, and whispers spread faster than fire through the fleet. The assassins were dead, and the human had killed them, alone. The princess looked at him, and in that silent moment something ancient shifted between them. Not duty, not ritual, but something raw and real, and above them, the Heartstone's glow burned brighter, as if the stars themselves were watching. The fleet's dawn was not like Earth's. It didn't rise in light but in the low thrum of engines and shifting shadows across the void. Every hallway, every silver corridor, every whisper on the royal flagship now carried Jake's name like a storm warning. The nobles, who once mocked him, now lowered their eyes. Their laughter curdled into quiet fear. The bodies of the assassins had already been removed, but their blood had left a message the council could not ignore. This wasn't some fragile creature they could toy with. This was humanity. The species that had survived its own monsters long before the galaxy even knew their name, and Jake walked through that ship with the silent weight of someone who understood exactly what he had done. Not with pride, not with shame, just the kind of cold clarity humans carried after being tested. In the war chamber, the council gathered, great figures carved of light and bone floating around the central dais. Their voices sharper now, no longer mocking but calculating, they whispered of rebellion, of humanity rising too fast, of an empire that might one day eclipse their own. They spoke of containment, manipulation, control, but no one dared to speak of open war, not after the Heartstone had chosen him. The law they wrote themselves now chained their hands. One elder slammed a clawed fist onto the table, snarling that the princess had doomed them all, while another hissed that perhaps she had just chosen the inevitable victor. And in the center of that storm, the Wraith envoy floated silently, its hollow eyes burning faint blue. It hadn't failed, it had only learned, and now it whispered that the next strike wouldn't be with blades, but with the council's most dangerous weapon, diplomacy. Meanwhile, in the royal chamber, the princess sat at the edge of the crystalline throne, her crown lying forgotten on the floor. She stared out into the starfield, her breath slow, her heart heavier than any royal decree. She had defied centuries of law, broken unspoken rules, chosen not a warrior bred for power but a human from a small world no one respected, and yet every choice she made since that moment seemed to ignite the universe itself. And when Jake entered, she didn't look at him as a queen would look at a subject. She looked at him like a woman standing on the edge of something unstoppable. He asked nothing, demanded nothing. He just stood near the glass with her, silent, the way humans do when words can't carry what's inside, and somehow that silence was louder than any oath. The next gathering was set in the High Council Hall, an ancient structure carved into the bones of a dead star. Its ceiling glowing like frozen lightning, thousands of alien nobles gathered, each wearing centuries of power on their shoulders, and at the center, beneath the massive Heartstone suspended in the air, stood Jake and the princess side by side. He wore no armor, no royal robes, just a simple black suit that made the alien nobility grind their teeth in insult. But when the doors opened, and the sound of the crowd fell into quiet tension, even the oldest among them could feel it. A shift, an unspoken presence that followed the human like the shadow of a storm. The Wraith envoy stepped forward, its voice a low echo that slid through the chamber like ice water. It spoke of tradition, of betrayal, of dangerous unions. It painted humanity as a disease, unpredictable and wild. A species that once burned their own world and would do the same to the stars. The council watched Jake like a predator watching prey, waiting for fear, for a flinch, for something weak to tear apart. But Jake didn't react. He simply raised his head and met their gaze, alien after alien, not like a politician, not like a soldier, but like someone who had stood in the rain too long to care about thunder anymore. The silence he carried wrapped around the chamber like iron chains. Then the princess spoke, and her voice cut through the room like a blade of light. She didn't beg, she didn't explain, she declared, reminding them of the law they wrote themselves, the law that bound the Heartstone's choice above any council decree. And then she turned to Jake, not as a shield, but as if they stood as equals, and said for all to hear, He was not chosen by me alone. He was chosen by the Heartstone itself. The room shuddered at the weight of it because in their culture, the Heartstone's will was the closest thing to a god. To challenge it would mean civil war across star systems. To accept it would mean humans now carried royal blood. In the upper balconies, some nobles rose in outrage, claws and tentacles thrashing in fury. Others stayed still, calculating, waiting, because they knew power when they saw it, and power had already shifted. The Wraith envoy hissed, promising that humanity would destroy everything, and Jake finally spoke, his voice low but sharp. Then you should have thought twice before asking a storm to stay in its cage. The chamber froze, not because of the words themselves, but the weight behind them. Something raw, something the aliens could not tame. And in that silence, the Heartstone pulsed once more, flooding the chamber with light like the first sunrise on a dead world, forcing every ancient house to bow their heads, not to him, but to the bond they couldn't break. Outside the council hall, the galaxy trembled, fleets repositioned, alliances cracked, empires whispered of war and rebellion. But the star that burned brightest was no longer alien. It was Earth's, and the storm the council tried to contain had already begun to spread. The sky outside the council hall was black and endless, the kind of silence that made galaxies feel small, but inside the royal flagship, nothing was silent anymore. Every corner of the ship buzzed with movement, soldiers repositioned, ships in nearby sectors shifted their orbits, messages burned across subspace lines, because what had happened in the council wasn't just a ceremony. It was a declaration. An ancient law had sealed Jake's bond with the princess, and with it came something the old powers feared more than war. Change, the kind that didn't ask for permission, the kind that rewrote history, and as Jake walked through the ship's silver halls, guards who once glared now stared in a different way, not with mockery but with the weight of uncertainty, as if they weren't sure whether to salute him or fear him. The princess sat in the strategy chamber, surrounded by a map made not of stars but of living threads of light, each thread a fleet, each light a world, all pulsing in time with the growing unrest across the empire. Her council of advisors argued around her like hounds circling a flame, some shouting to embrace this union to strengthen the throne, others hissing that the human must be isolated, controlled, turned into a symbol but not a power. But her voice cut through them like winter wind, calm, quiet, final. She reminded them that the Heartstone's will was not a suggestion, and those who stood against it stood against the very law that had built their throne. Some advisors lowered their eyes, others clenched their jaws, but none dared to say what they truly feared, that the storm had already slipped their hands. Jake entered the room without ceremony, no fanfare, no guards at his back, just his quiet steps echoing across the chamber, and the advisors froze, some out of respect, others out of disgust. But none of them could meet his eyes for long. The princess turned to him, and for a moment, the walls around her fell away. She wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was a woman standing between two worlds colliding. She asked him if he understood what he'd stepped into, and he gave her a small nod, because Jake wasn't naive, he knew the council wasn't done, he knew war might come, and he also knew humans didn't back away from storms. They walked into them, far beyond the flagship, in the black cradle of a forgotten system. The Wraith envoy moved through the shadows of a hidden fleet, its ship like a living wound in space. Its voice echoed through the cold halls of warlords and old houses that had long waited for the chance to tear the throne down. It whispered of rebellion, of burning the princess's legacy to ash before the bond could spread. They didn't need to destroy the human, they just needed to make the galaxy fear him enough to unite. Against Earth, one house pledged their warships, another their assassins, and in the darkness, a coalition was born, not of law but of hatred, forged in the fear of a species they could no longer control. Back on the flagship, Jake trained in the observation deck, a space open to the stars, the gravity light, the air cold, his breath steady, sweat beating across his skin as the ship's automated defense drones moved around him like silver ghosts, attacking and retreating, testing him not as a soldier but as a survivor, and he moved like someone who'd fought for survival long before this galaxy even noticed Earth existed. No elegance, no royal stance, just raw, human stubbornness that bent instead of breaking, and in the shadows above, hidden eyes watched him. Some guards, some spies, some enemies already questioning whether their fear was misplaced or justified. The princess approached him in the quiet after the drills. The stars stretched wide behind her like a curtain of glass and fire, and she asked him something she hadn't dared before. Why humans kept standing even when the world turned against them. Jake leaned against the railing, his voice quiet, almost distant. Because no one ever came to save us, he said. We learned to be our own storm. And she felt that answer in her chest like a weight, because in her world power was inherited. But in his, it was earned with blood and grit. As the night deepened, alarms rang across the fleet. Unknown signatures had been detected at the edge of the system, ships bearing no crest, no banner, just the cold silence of war. The Wraith's rebellion had come sooner than expected, and the royal guards flooded the decks as stars beyond flickered with the first glimmer of an enemy fleet. The princess stood beside Jake at the viewport, her eyes burning gold in the dark. The storm was here, and Jake's quiet voice cut through the rising chaos. Then let's show them what humanity does when cornered. The war drums of the galaxy began to beat, not with ceremony, not with council votes, but with the low hum of engines igniting across star systems, and the union between a princess and a human had become more than a scandal or a prophecy. It had become the spark of a galactic war. The enemy fleet emerged from the void like a silent blade, thousands of ships with no banners, no mercy, their hulls blacker than the space around them, swallowing starlight, a rebellion born not from honor but from fear. Their commanders believed they could strike fast, crush the princess, erase the human, and restore the council's old order before it fractured completely. The royal flagship shuddered as the first wave of energy signatures flashed across the system. The alarms sang like wolves in the night, and the crew moved with the sharp efficiency of those who knew war had come whether they wanted it or not. Every deck of the ship came alive, weapons rotating, shields roaring to life. But in the center of it all stood Jake and the princess, shoulder to shoulder. The storm they'd both felt was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was here. The bridge lights dimmed as the tactical screens filled with red flares of approaching vessels. The enemy numbers were overwhelming. Rows upon rows of battleships, carriers, and strike crafts stretching like a swarm. The generals whispered that retreat was the only chance. They called the humans' bond a weakness, a spark that had dragged them to the edge of war. But when the princess stepped forward, her voice sliced through their fear, steady and burning with the weight of someone who had made her choice. No more hiding behind old rules, she said. If they want a war, they'll have to bleed for it. And when she turned to Jake, she saw not a subject, not a fragile human, but someone who carried Earth's defiance like a weapon carved in bone. Jake walked to the viewport, staring at the endless wave of enemy ships, his breath slow, calm, and for a moment the bridge fell silent. The princess realized why the council feared humans. Not because of their numbers, not because of their technology, but because of what burned behind their eyes when the world tried to crush them. He placed his hand on the command rail and spoke, not to beg, not to command, but to remind everyone on that bridge of something old and dangerous. They're not ready for what happens when you corner a human. The words were quiet, but they rolled through the room like a cannon shot, settling in the hearts of soldiers who had never fought beside one of his kind. The first wave struck like a hammer, explosions lit the darkness like dying suns. The royal fleet trembled but didn't fall. The princess barked orders in a calm, unwavering tone, turning scattered ships into a wall of fire and steel. Jake moved between stations like someone who had lived with machines all his life, rerouting power, re-rigging overloaded reactors, shouting simple, clear commands that cut through the panic like wind through smoke. And for the first time, alien soldiers began to follow a human's lead, not because they were ordered to, but because his presence made the fear quieter, the chaos smaller. Enemy boarding pods slammed into the hull, steel claws ripping through the flagship's skin, and the battle became something raw, close, brutal. Alien shock troopers poured through the breach like shadows with teeth, but they didn't find a fragile human waiting. They found Jake, covered in the blood of those who thought Earth was weak, fighting with nothing but stripped-down weapons, grit, and the fury of a man defending what he chose to stand for. The princess fought at his side, not like a ruler hiding behind guards, but like a blade forged beside him. And the corridors of the ship burned with the sound of resistance. As the hours bled into the void, something shifted in the stars. Other fleets, alien factions who had watched from the sidelines, began to move. Some expected to see the royal fleet fall, But what they saw instead was the impossible. A single human and a princess standing against an army and refusing to bend. The Heartstone pulsed across space like a beacon, a soundless roar that echoed through ancient oaths, and one by one, ships from distant houses turned their bows toward the battlefield. Not for politics, not for law, but for the fire that was spreading like a living thing. The Wraith envoy, hidden in the shadows of its flagship, watched in fury as its carefully built rebellion began to fracture. Some of its allies hesitated, others turned against it, because the thing they feared most was now in front of them. A story too powerful to erase, and when Jake breached the envoy's command vessel, dragging open its steel corridors like they were paper, it realized too late that this wasn't a political enemy but a human, and humans didn't conquer with elegance. They survived until everything else burned down. The final clash echoed like thunder across the void, and when the smoke cleared, the rebellion's fleet hung silent, broken, drifting like ash across a dead sky. The royal fleet bloodied but unbroken. The princess stood over the viewport, the Heartstone glowing so bright it painted the bridge in gold, and beside her stood Jake, bruised, scarred, but unbowed. Their bond wasn't just royal. It had become a legend. Across the galaxy, whispers spread like fire, not of a human as a mistake but as a storm that could not be stopped, and old powers that once mocked Earth now spoke its name with caution. The princess turned to him, her voice soft against the fading sound of war. "You changed everything." And Jake just gave a tired smile, because that was what humans did. They changed everything without asking permission, and far beyond. Among the stars that had watched silently, a new story began to burn into history, the tale of the princess and the human who defied the galaxy. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories, because sometimes the greatest weapon in the universe is simply being human.